I crouched by the window, watching as the figures moved with careful precision along the edges of my property, their flashlights sweeping over the ground like they were looking for something specific. My grip tightened around my phone as I whispered my location to the sheriff's dispatcher, my voice low but firm. The operator assured me that deputies were on their way, but minutes felt like hours as I remained frozen in place, heart hammering as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just some HOA stunt anymore. This was trespassing in the dead of night, and whoever was outside wasn't just leaving notices in my mailbox. They were looking for something. Or worse, they were trying to send a message. I moved carefully toward the back of my house, keeping to the shadows as I peeked out another window to get a better angle. The men were dressed in dark clothing, their faces barely visible under the glow of their flashlights. One of them knelt near the spot where the HOA stakes had been placed, running his hand over the dirt as if searching for proof that I had removed them. Another stood near my barn, scribbling something down on a notepad while occasionally glancing toward the road, as if expecting someone to arrive. The third paced along my driveway, scanning the area like he was checking for security cameras. My stomach twisted at the realization that this wasn't random. This was planned. Then, as if on cue, headlights appeared in the distance. The figures froze, their flashlights clicking off almost instantly as they darted toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness just as the sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway. I exhaled sharply, finally allowing myself to move, stepping away from the window and toward the front door, my pulse still racing. The deputies stepped out cautiously, hands resting on their belts as they took in the eerie silence around them. I wasted no time explaining what had happened, pointing toward the areas where the trespassers had been just moments before. The deputies exchanged looks, their faces unreadable as they listened, before one of them began sweeping the property with his flashlight while the other took my statement. There were no footprints left behind, no evidence beyond my word and the lingering sense that someone had been watching me for far too long. But the sheriff's department took it seriously, promising to increase patrols in the area and advising me to document everything in case this escalated further. The cold reassurance did little to settle the unease curling in my gut. As the deputies left, I stood in my doorway, staring out at the empty land ahead of me, wondering just how far the HOA was willing to go. The answer came the next morning. A bright orange notice was nailed to my fence, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze as I yanked it free. The bold, capitalized letters were impossible to miss. Final notice: failure to comply will result in legal action. The accusations were the same: unauthorized structures, non-compliant landscaping, refusal to adhere to HOA regulations, but this time, they had added something new. Occupancy violation, unauthorized residence subject to removal. I stared at the words, my grip tightening around the paper as disbelief settled into something colder, something sharper. They were claiming that my house, my legally owned property, was an unauthorized residence. They weren't just trying to fine me or harass me anymore. They were trying to force me out. I took the notice inside, laying it flat on my kitchen table as I reached for my phone again. ISA answered on the second ring, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice even before I explained the latest development. She didn't sound surprised, only more determined, as she assured me that the HOA had absolutely no legal right to challenge my occupancy. But this was a clear sign that they weren't backing down. They were escalating, hoping I'd panic, hoping I'd cave under the pressure. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just some passive homeowner they could steamroll over. I wasn't afraid of a legal battle. If they wanted one, I was ready. Within hours, ISA had filed an official complaint with the county, detailing the HOA's harassment and false claims over my property. She also sent a second cease and desist letter, this one stronger, more direct, warning them that if they continued their actions, we would be pursuing a lawsuit for damages. The pressure was shifting, and for the first time, I could feel the tide turning in my favor. But Karen wasn't finished. 2 days later, a tow truck showed up in my driveway. I was in my barn when I heard the rumbling engine, followed by the sound of heavy boots on gravel. I stepped outside just in time to see a uniformed man walking toward my house, clipboard in hand, his expression businesslike but impersonal. Behind him, the truck idled, its flatbed empty, waiting. The man barely glanced at me as he flipped through his paperwork before making his announcement. According to HOA regulations, unauthorized vehicles were subject to immediate removal, and my truck, parked neatly in my own driveway, was apparently in violation. I barely held back a laugh as I asked him who had sent the order, already knowing the answer. He didn't even hesitate before mentioning the HOA, claiming they had issued the complaint due to my failure to register the vehicle with the community's compliance board. It was absurd. Beyond absurd. My property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, and even if it was, no rule on earth would allow them to tow a legally owned vehicle from private land. I told him as much, but he simply shrugged, informing me that unless I had immediate proof, he was under contract to remove the vehicle. I pulled out my phone, not to argue, but to record. If they wanted to play dirty, I would make sure every single attempt at harassment was documented. The tow truck driver hesitated when he saw the camera, shifting uncomfortably before muttering that he was just following orders. But I wasn't backing down. I called the sheriff's department again, letting them know exactly what was happening. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, and as soon as the deputy stepped out and took one look at the situation, it was clear that the HOA had overstepped once again. The tow truck left empty. The deputy didn't even bother hiding his irritation as he advised me to consider filing a restraining order against the HOA board for continued harassment. I could see the words sinking in, see the weight of them settling on the tow truck driver's shoulders as he climbed back into his cab, realizing he had almost been caught up in something illegal. But Karen wasn't the type to care about legalities. She cared about power, and as I watched the tow truck disappear down the road, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about HOA rules. This was about control. And she had just realized she was starting to lose it. That I knew the moment the tow truck pulled away that the fight was nearing its peak. The HOA had exhausted their usual tactics, and now they were grasping at anything, hoping I would break under the pressure. But I wasn't breaking. I was more resolved than ever. If anything, their desperation only proved that I was winning. That didn't mean they were finished, though. Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully, and I had no doubt she was already planning her next move. The real question was how far she was willing to go. I got my answer 2 days later when I woke up to the sound of voices outside. It was early, the sun barely rising, but there they were, half a dozen HOA members standing at the edge of my property, clipboard-wielding enforcers who looked more like a group of bureaucrats on a mission than neighbors. They weren't alone. A security vehicle, complete with flashing amber lights, was parked near the entrance to my driveway, the word, "Community Compliance," painted across the side in bold lettering. The sight was almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. I stepped outside, heart pounding, knowing that this was the final act in their desperate play. They had no legal ground, no real authority, but they were still here, still pushing, still hoping that intimidation would do what their rules and fines couldn't. One of them stepped forward, a man I vaguely recognized from the HOA meetings I had been barred from attending. He had the look of someone who had been given power for the first time in his life and was determined to wield it, no matter how small or meaningless it was. He cleared his throat and, in a tone dripping with self-importance, announced that my property was officially considered non-compliant and subject to enforcement measures. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I simply folded my arms, waiting, watching as they went through the motions, as if reading from some invisible script Karen had prepared for them. They listed off the same accusations, the same fabricated violations, the same claims that I had been warned and refused to comply. Then, they unveiled their final threat. A formal order of eviction. I didn't even blink as they held out the paper, the official-looking document stamped with the HOA's logo, complete with vague references to community ordinances that didn't apply to me. It was a bluff. A ridiculous, legally meaningless bluff. But the audacity of it, the sheer arrogance of standing on land they had no claim to and pretending otherwise, was enough to make my blood boil. I didn't take the paper. I didn't even acknowledge it. I simply turned, walked back inside, and did the one thing that Karen had never expected. I called the media. It didn't take much. Local reporters loved stories like this: small-town corruption, overreaching HOAs, a homeowner fighting back against abuse of power. Within hours, the story was circulating online, and by the next morning, news crews were parked near my driveway, cameras rolling, microphones extended as they asked for interviews. I gave them everything. I showed them the letters, the fines, the police reports. I explained how the HOA had fabricated violations, how they had tried to claim my land, how they had trespassed and even attempted to have my vehicle towed. I held up the eviction notice, shaking my head at the absurdity of it, and watched as the public reaction turned against Karen and her little kingdom of enforcers. By noon, the backlash had started. Neighbors who had once avoided me out of fear were now whispering amongst themselves, questioning why the HOA had gone so far, why they had spent so much time and effort on a property that wasn't even theirs to control. More and more people began coming forward with their own stories: fines for mailbox colors, threats over minor landscaping choices, penalties for leaving trash cans out a few minutes too long. The more people spoke, the clearer it became that Karen hadn't just been targeting me. She had been ruling with an iron fist for years, and now, thanks to the media attention, the entire community was seeing her for what she really was. That evening, I received an email from the HOA's attorney. The tone was different this time. No threats, no demands, just a simple statement: Karen had overstepped, and the board was conducting an internal review. I almost laughed. An internal review. It was a thinly veiled way of saying they were looking for a way out, trying to distance themselves before the entire HOA crumbled under the weight of Karen's arrogance. But I didn't care about their review. I had already won. 2 weeks later, the HOA held an emergency meeting, one that I was finally allowed to attend. It wasn't hard to see the shift in power. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual confidence gone, her eyes darting nervously as one by one, board members questioned her actions. The neighbors who had once supported her now looked at her with suspicion, resentment even. And when the vote was called, the decision was unanimous. Karen was out. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She simply gathered her things, her face pale, and walked out of the meeting without a word. Within a month, she had moved out of the neighborhood entirely. The new HOA president, a man named Russell, wasted no time cleaning house. The bogus fines were dropped. The absurd rules were re-evaluated. And as for my property? I was left alone. It was over. I stood on my porch that evening, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air finally feeling lighter, freer. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I truly owned my land. No threats. No fines. No unwanted visits in the dead of night. Just peace. And as I took a deep breath, letting the silence settle, I realized something else. Karen had tried to control me, to force me into submission, to bend my will under the weight of her so-called authority. But in the end, she had lost. And I had won. I never thought I'd end up in a full-blown battle with a homeowners association, much less have the police called on me for simply existing on my own property. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that HOAs operate less like community organizers and more like self-appointed dictators who thrive on power. I had no idea what I was walking into when I bought my house, but looking back now, I should have known that nothing involving an HOA ever goes smoothly. It all started when I finally managed to escape city life. I had spent years crammed into a tiny apartment, listening to the endless honking of traffic, the muffled arguments of neighbors through paper-thin walls, and the never-ending cycle of rent hikes. I wanted space, peace, and a place where I could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in on me. I'd always dreamed of owning land, a place where I could wake up to the sound of birds instead of car alarms, where I could walk outside and feel the earth beneath my feet instead of concrete. So, after years of saving, I found the perfect house. It was old, a little worn down, but full of charm and character. It sat on several acres of land, surrounded by tall trees and open fields. It was a place with history, not just some cookie-cutter development thrown together overnight. Best of all, it was far away from the endless rules and regulations of city living. Or so I thought. The trouble began almost immediately. A week after moving in, I found a letter in my mailbox. The envelope was crisp, the kind that makes you think you're getting a check, but inside was something far less welcome. A list of violations that I had apparently committed. Unapproved mailbox. Grass too tall. Unauthorized structure. The structure in question? My barn. The same barn that had been standing for over 50 years, long before these people even existed. I was confused. I had specifically chosen this house because it was outside of any HOA jurisdiction. I pulled out my property deed, checked the boundaries, and confirmed what I already knew: my land was not, and never had been, part of any HOA. This had to be a mistake. So, like any rational person, I called the number listed on the letter. That was my first mistake. The woman who answered introduced herself as Karen, not making this up, president of the HOA. Her voice was sharp, the kind that makes you feel like you're in trouble even when you've done nothing wrong. The conversation went downhill fast. The moment I explained that I wasn't part of the HOA, she cut me off. "Our records indicate otherwise," she said flatly. "All homes in this area must comply with HOA regulations." I tried to explain that my property was separate, that I had the legal documents to prove it, but she wasn't listening. "If you refuse to comply, we will be forced to take further action," she snapped before hanging up. I was stunned. This wasn't just some mix-up, they were trying to control a property they had no rights over. I figured I'd let it go, surely they'd realize their mistake and leave me alone. That was my second mistake. Over the next few weeks, the letters kept coming. Each one more aggressive than the last. Then came the fines. $50 per day, then $100, then $200. All for violations that didn't apply to me. I ignored them, knowing they had no legal power over me, but then things took a turn. One afternoon, I stepped outside to find two strangers in uniform standing on my land, taking notes on clipboards. They had the stiff posture of men who thought they were more important than they really were. I approached them calmly, but the taller one didn't even bother looking up. "Routine inspection," he muttered. "For what?" I asked. "For compliance," the shorter one added. I almost laughed. "I'm not in your HOA," I said. "You have no reason to be here." They exchanged glances. Then the taller one said, "We were told to check." Told by who? No answer. Just silence and shifting feet. That's when I realized, they were trespassing. "Get off my property," I said, my voice firm. They hesitated. I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." "You have 10 seconds. That did it. They turned and walked off, but not before the taller one smirked. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said before disappearing down my driveway. That night, I had a feeling this wasn't over. And I was right. Because the next morning, I woke up to flashing red and blue lights in my driveway. The HOA had called the cops on me. I stepped outside, heart pounding, trying to keep my expression neutral as two officers stood near their squad cars, hands resting on their belts. The cold morning air did nothing to cool the fire of frustration building in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what absurd accusation the HOA had come up with this time. One of the officers, an older man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, gave me a long, measured look before finally speaking. He said they had received reports of a trespasser on the property. It took me a second to process the sheer stupidity of the claim. A trespasser? On my own land? I glanced toward the street and, sure enough, standing there with her arms crossed like a queen overseeing her kingdom was Karen. Her expression was smug, full of self-righteous confidence, as if she had already won whatever ridiculous game she was playing. I exhaled slowly, forcing my voice to remain calm as I explained to the officers that this was my property, that I had the legal deed, and that I was not, in fact, trespassing on my own land. One of them seemed to hesitate, but the younger one, who had that eager-to-prove-himself energy, was already flipping through his notepad, looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. I could feel the tension thick in the air, the weight of Karen's silent pressure looming over the scene, as if she were daring them to act. The older officer finally asked if I had proof of ownership, and without missing a beat, I turned on my heel and walked inside to grab my documents. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the deed, my mind flashing through all the ways this could go wrong. When I stepped back outside, I handed the paperwork to the officer, watching as he scanned the details. His brow furrowed slightly, his lips pressing together as he read. The younger cop shifted impatiently, eyes darting between me and Karen, who was now pretending to be innocently unaware of the growing tension. After what felt like an eternity, the older officer cleared his throat and turned to Karen, asking if she had any evidence to support her claim that I was trespassing. For the first time, her confidence wavered. She stammered something about how the HOA had jurisdiction over all properties in the community, that I was in clear violation of their rules, and that my refusal to comply meant I was in the wrong. The officer's face remained unreadable as he looked back at my deed. He flipped a few more pages, then let out a sigh, shaking his head slightly before turning to Karen again. He told her that my property was, in fact, not under the HOA's control, that I had full ownership, and that legally, they had no authority over me. The color drained from her face, but she quickly recovered, her voice rising as she insisted that they needed to do something, that I was creating a hostile environment for the neighborhood by refusing to comply. I crossed my arms, watching as the officers exchanged glances, clearly growing tired of whatever mess they had been dragged into. Karen's voice grew shriller as she accused me of being a troublemaker, of disregarding the community's values, of disrespecting the rules that everyone else followed. The younger officer seemed momentarily caught in her web, but the older one had already made up his mind. He handed my documents back to me, apologizing for the inconvenience, before turning back to Karen and making it very clear that this was not a criminal matter. I watched as she sputtered, her hands clenching into fists as she tried to argue, but the officers were already stepping back toward their cars, ready to leave. I should have felt relieved, but something in Karen's eyes made me uneasy. There was no acceptance, no sign that she had given up. If anything, she looked more determined than ever, and that meant one thing: this wasn't over. Sure enough, the moment the police left, I found another letter in my mailbox, this one more aggressive than before. The language was harsher, the threats more severe. There were mentions of fines, legal action, and even a claim that they had the right to place a lien on my property if I continued to ignore their demands. It was laughable, really, but also infuriating. I knew I needed to take action, but I wanted to play this smart. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of legal documentation I had, from my deed to county records proving I had never been part of the HOA. I researched property laws, read through horror stories of other homeowners who had been harassed by overreaching associations, and even reached out to a lawyer to see what my next step should be. The more I dug, the clearer it became: Karen wasn't just mistaken. She knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about enforcing rules, this was about control. She had expected me to fold, to bow down to her authority like everyone else. But she had underestimated me. A few days later, I woke up to a new escalation. This time, it wasn't just a letter in my mailbox. This time, my property had been marked. Wooden stakes lined the edges of my land, bright red tape stretched between them. A large sign had been placed near my driveway, stamped with an official-looking HOA seal. The words, "Future Development Site," were printed in bold letters across it. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind struggling to catch up. They weren't just trying to find me or harass me with paperwork. They were trying to take my land. And that's when I knew, this war had only just begun. I stood there staring at the sign, the bold letters practically mocking me as the morning sun cast long shadows across my land. My stomach churned, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't just an overreach. This was an outright attack. They were trying to claim my property as part of their so-called community development project, and they didn't even have the decency to inform me before marking my land like I was nothing more than an obstacle in their grand vision. I clenched my fists, taking slow breaths to keep myself from marching straight to Karen's house and demanding an explanation. But I already knew what she would say. She would feign innocence, act as if this was all a misunderstanding, and then double down on her claims that I had no choice but to comply. Instead of wasting my energy confronting her, I did what I should have done the moment this nonsense started. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer. The moment Isa Carter answered, I felt a sense of control return, even if only slightly. I laid everything out for her, from the letters to the police visit to the stakes and sign that had appeared overnight. She didn't sound surprised. In fact, she let out a small sigh before telling me that cases like mine were more common than people realized. HOAs, especially the power-hungry ones, often operated under the assumption that homeowners wouldn't fight back. They relied on intimidation, legal jargon, and sheer persistence to force compliance, even when they had no legal standing. But this situation was different. They weren't just sending fines or empty threats, they were laying physical claim to land they had no right to. That was a serious escalation. ISA assured me that my deed and county records were on my side. Legally, the HOA had no authority over my property, and any attempt to enforce their rules was not only invalid but could be considered harassment. The stakes and signage? That was another issue entirely. If they had placed those markers on my land without permission, that was trespassing, possibly even an attempt at fraudulent claim staking. She advised me to document everything before taking any action, so I spent the next hour photographing every single marker, the sign, the property lines, and the surrounding areas for reference. Then, I did what felt like the most satisfying thing in the world. I walked across my property, one by one, and pulled each stake from the ground, tossing them into a pile near the edge of my barn. The sign took a little more effort, but soon enough, it lay flat, face down in the dirt where it belonged. The next morning, it was back. Every single stake, every piece of red tape, the same sign standing exactly where it had been the day before. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took in the sight, realizing just how far they were willing to go. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was persistence. This was a message. They weren't going to stop. That's when I noticed the black sedan parked just down the road, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. It hadn't been there the day before, but now it sat there, unmoving, as if whoever was inside was waiting for something. The longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. Someone was watching me. I pretended not to notice, walking past the sign and heading toward my barn as if I had no interest in what was happening, but inside, I was fuming. I called ISA again, and this time, she didn't just advise me, she took action. Within hours, a formal cease and desist letter was drafted, sent directly to the HOA board and Karen herself. It detailed their overreach, cited property laws proving I was not under their jurisdiction, and included a demand that they immediately stop all attempts to enforce their rules upon me. Any further actions, including trespassing on my land or marking it again, would result in legal consequences. It felt good knowing that I was no longer just playing defense. I was fighting back. But Karen was not the type to back down quietly. 2 days later, I received a formal notice from an attorney representing the HOA, accusing me of interfering with community development plans and refusing to comply with necessary regulations. The language was aggressive, full of legal-sounding jargon meant to intimidate me, but underneath it all, it was nothing more than a desperate bluff. The best part? They had nothing to stand on. Their entire argument rested on the assumption that my property was part of their jurisdiction, but the documents I held in my hands proved otherwise. ISA wasted no time drafting a counter-response, this time warning them that any further legal action would be met with a lawsuit of our own. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I had the upper hand. They had pushed, and I had pushed back harder. The silence that followed was almost unsettling. No letters, no more stakes, no unexpected visits. Even the black sedan disappeared for a while. I almost allowed myself to believe it was over. Then the real storm hit. Late one night, I was woken up by the sound of movement outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a stray dog sniffing around near my barn. But as I sat up in bed, ears straining, I realized this was different. Footsteps. More than one set. I moved cautiously to the window, heart pounding as I peered outside. In the dim light of my porch lamp, I saw them, 3 figures walking the perimeter of my property, flashlights scanning the ground as if searching for something. My breath hitched as I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the sheriff's department. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was an invasion.